Tonight, we're not going to talk about wars or kings or castles. We're going to talk about fear, the kind that lived in quiet corners, the kind that crept under doorways and curled around your thoughts at night. Because in the Middle Ages, fear wasn't always loud. It wasn't always on the battlefield. Sometimes it was in the sky or the forest or the silence between church bells. People feared sin and storms and sickness with no name. They feared the devil hiding in plain sight. They feared hunger. They feared being forgotten. But most of all, they feared what they couldn't see and what they couldn't explain. So get comfortable. Take a slow breath. Let your thoughts settle like dust on a wooden floor. You're safe here. But the people we're going to meet tonight, they lived in a world where the next knock, the next shadow, the next fever might change everything. This is Boring History for Sleep, a podcast where nothing happens quickly and every worry is centuries old. If you find peace in the quiet pace of the past, consider listening all the way through. Or just let it carry you softly into sleep. Either way, we'll begin now. In the Middle Ages, night didn't mean what it means now. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't a time to unwind. It was something to survive. When the sun dropped behind the hills, the world, you could feel it in the way the air turned colder, sharper, like the darkness carried weight. The village slowed, but it didn't rest. Fires were fed, doors were bolted, prayers were said in whispers, because once the light was gone, the rules shifted. The edge of the field became the edge of something else entirely. There were no street lamps, no distant hum of cars, just wind creaking wood, the occasional bark of a restless dog, and the things you hoped you never had to hear. The snap of a twig where no one should be walking, a moan that might be wind or something older. Even familiar sounds became threats in the dark. An owl's cry could send a shiver down your back. The rustle of dry leaves might be feet. You listened harder when the light was gone, and the more you listened, the more you imagined. Some homes had candles or tallow lamps, but they were small and weak, and the smoke clung to the ceiling. Most people didn't light more than one. Fuel was precious. Flame was dangerous. If it fell, the house could burn faster than a scream. So the dark wasn't just outside. It pressed in through the windows, slipped through the beams, and filled the corners of every room. You didn't sleep deeply. You slept in pieces. One ear open, one hand near a knife, or a stick, or a stone, whatever you kept near your bed just in case. You feared bandits, yes, but also spirits, the ones that came through locked doors and under thresholds. The old stories said they walked at night, the ones who had died in sin, the ones who hadn't been buried right. You didn't say their names out loud after sunset. You didn't want to invite them in. Some people hung iron over their doors. Others carved crosses into their wooden beams. Not because it always worked, but because it was something to do. If you had animals, you checked the barn twice. Not just for thieves, but for signs. Hoofprints that went the wrong direction. A chicken missing its head. A calf trembling without reason. The night didn't have to speak clearly. It only had to hint, and that was enough. You didn't wander after dark unless you had to, and if you did, you didn't go alone. Not because you believed every story, but because everyone else did. And that belief shaped the air, it shaped the path, it made every shadow longer. The sun always came back, you knew that, but it didn't always feel like a promise. Sometimes it felt like a mercy, because the night was never quiet, and fear in the Middle Ages began when the light disappeared. You might have made it through the night, but morning didn't mean the fear was gone. It just changed shape. During the day, your world was smaller, bound to the land, to the fields, to the animals that needed feeding. But even under daylight, there were places you didn't trust. places where the soil turned strange or the wind moved wrong, places that felt like they remembered things people tried to forget. The edge of the field was one of those places, beyond the last row of barley or rye, where the tilled earth gave way to brush and tangle. There was always the sense that something else was watching. You might not have said it aloud, but you knew it in your chest. The hedgerows grew too thick. The trees leaned in too close. Birds didn't sing there the same way, and you didn't turn your back on it for long. People said demons lived there, not like the ones in paintings, but quiet ones. The kind that whispered in your ear and made you stumble. The kind that turned a healthy cow wild. The kind that called to children who wandered too far and led them deeper, where roots were slick with moss and light disappeared faster than it should. The church had its own names for these things: tempters, tormentors, shadows that slipped between the cracks of God's world to test your soul. But for most villagers, there was no need to name them. It was enough to feel them, enough to know that the edge of the field was not empty, that something was there, and that it did not wish you well. You wore charms sometimes, bits of cloth tied with sacred words, a coin that had touched a relic, a nail bent into a crooked shape, not because they made you invincible, but because they made you feel less alone. Fear is quieter when you carry something, even if it's only a scrap of wood blessed 3 counties away. When something went wrong, a bad harvest, a missing child, a strange illness that turned the skin grey, people looked to the edges first, not just of the field, but of the village, of the known world, as if misfortune started out there with things just beyond reach and slowly crept inward like frost through cracks in the floor. You kept your distance. You didn't cut the trees back too far. You didn't build too close to the woods. You let the edge remain the edge, because blurring that line was asking for trouble. Even now, centuries later, you might feel it if you walk past an old field at dusk. That hush just before the birds stop singing. That moment when the grass rustles and you can't tell if it's the wind or something else. Back then, they didn't question it. They knew what lived at the edges, and they knew better than to go looking for it. It wasn't only what waited in the woods that made people afraid. Sometimes the fear came from within the village, from within your own chest, from the eyes of the priest standing quietly at the front of the church, hands folded, voice low, speaking not just to God, but to you, and not just to what you did, but what you thought. Because in the Middle Ages, sin wasn't just action, it was breath, it was impulse, a glance that lingered too long, a word that went unspoken, a feeling you didn't admit but couldn't shake. You were told God saw everything. But more than that, the church reminded you he judged what no one else could see, and so did they. The people around you, your neighbors, your family, your confessor. It didn't matter if you never said the thing aloud, if you kept it locked behind your teeth. The fear was that someone would know anyway, that you'd be found out for something you hadn't even done yet, something you only imagined. Confession wasn't just ritual, it was survival. You went because you had to, because your soul needed scrubbing, because sin accumulated like dust, and the longer it stayed, the heavier it got. You sat in the dark and whispered your secrets to a man who sat behind a screen, and he listened. And sometimes he paused a little too long before absolving you. That pause stayed with you longer than the penance. That pause made you wonder if he truly believed you were clean. You were told to examine yourself daily, to search your heart for hidden offenses, pride, envy, lust, sloth. Even in the stillest moments, when nothing had gone wrong, there was fear that you'd missed something, that a stray thought had taken root, that the devil had spoken, and you hadn't recognized his voice. Children were taught young, not just what was right, but what was dangerous. And the danger didn't always look like fire and brimstone. Sometimes it looked like a question asked in the wrong tone, a curiosity not yet punished, a desire that didn't belong to you but showed up anyway. People believed that evil could walk into a person quietly, like fog under a door, that no one would notice until it had already settled behind their eyes. You feared the priest, not because he shouted, but because he didn't have to, because his silence carried weight, because his sermons shaped how others looked at you, because he stood between you and the judgment that could follow you into the grave. At night, when you lay still, the woods were quiet. The village was still, but your mind wasn't. You sifted through your day, trying to remember if you'd looked too long, or spoken too harshly, or wished for something you weren't allowed to want. You prayed to be forgiven for what you didn't even realize you'd done, because the church didn't just tell you how to live. It taught you how to fear your own reflection. Even if your conscience was clear, even if your soul had been scrubbed clean in confession, you still didn't sleep without a knife. You didn't talk about it, not really. It was just something you did, like shuttering the windows before nightfall or stacking wood near the door before winter. The knife wasn't for show. It wasn't ceremonial. It was practical, plain, something old, kept sharp out of habit, tucked beneath straw mattresses or under folded blankets, close enough to reach without thinking, because in the dark you didn't have time to think. It wasn't just fear of demons or wandering spirits. It wasn't even just about thieves, though they came too. It was everything. All the dangers that didn't sleep when you did. A sudden knock on the door when no one should be knocking. A stranger's silhouette moving through the orchard. The barn door creaking open when it should have been barred. The kind of sounds that pulled you out of shallow sleep with your heart already racing and your fingers already reaching. Villages were small, but danger didn't need numbers. One man with a grudge, one raider straying too far from a road, one wolf, hungry and lost, creeping too close to your goats. You learned quickly that hope wasn't a plan. Hope didn't stop bleeding. Hope didn't chase off a shadow already inside your doorway, but a knife might. Children learned early. Fathers passed down stories without full explanations. Just the gesture of reaching under the bed, just the look exchanged before the candle was blown out. You didn't need to ask why. You understood it in your bones, the way animals understand storms before they arrive. Even when nothing happened, you still kept it near. Even if years passed without the blade being drawn, the distance between the quiet and the memory of danger never felt wide enough to relax. Some knives were old enough to have names, not grand ones, not heroic. Just quiet nicknames passed down through hands that had learned to hold fear carefully. The knife wasn't about courage. It was about control. It was about having one thing, just one, that you could do something with if everything else collapsed. You didn't think of yourself as violent. You hoped never to use it. But you knew what the world was like, and knowing made you cautious. It made you slower to trust, quicker to listen, sharper, in the moments between the wind shifting and the candle flickering. The knife reminded you that safety was fragile, and sometimes it was your job to hold it in your hand. You slept lightly. You dreamed in fragments. And when you woke in the dark, unsure of what stirred outside, your fingers went to the same place every time. Not for comfort, not for revenge, but because survival wasn't guaranteed. It never had been, not here. And in the quiet places between prayers and sleep, the knife kept you from being the only one unarmed. You kept the knife for what came through the village, but the forest was different. The forest didn't knock. It didn't explain itself. It didn't ask permission to take what it wanted. It just watched and waited, and sometimes reminded you that it had been there longer than your house, longer than your church, longer than the name of your village had ever been spoken aloud. It was older than your tools and bigger than your stories, and it didn't forgive. There were trails you followed, Ones worn smooth by generations of feet, but even those weren't safe. Trees close, sound shifted. You could be 10 steps from the edge of the field and already feel lost. The forest swallowed things quickly. Light, direction, time, people. You didn't go in alone. You didn't go in without a reason. And even then, you made offerings. A gesture, a word, a piece of bread tucked into the roots of an old oak. Not because you thought the trees would answer, but because something might be listening. Something that remembered the last person who forgot to show respect. Hunters entered the forest with full bellies and empty hearts. They walked softly. They never sang. They came back with meat and scratches and stories they didn't finish telling. Some came back different, quieter, eyes more distant, a wrongness in the way they stood still for too long, like they were still listening for something in the branches. Children were warned early. Don't stray, don't follow sounds, don't chase animals into the dark. There were too many stories of those who had. Stories where names were spoken less and less each season, until even the memory of their voices faded into the trees. You feared wolves, yes, but you feared the forest more, because wolves had bodies they bled. They ran. The forest just stood there, thick and endless. The forest didn't need to move to trap you. It didn't need to attack to consume you. It just waited patiently, while you convinced yourself you still knew the way out. And sometimes it let you go. Let you stumble back into the clearing, breathless and shaken and unsure of how much time had passed. You didn't speak of what you saw. Not because it was terrible, but because it didn't fit. Shapes that moved wrong, trees that hummed. A moment where you heard your own name whispered behind you when no one was there. So you stayed near the center of the village. You lit candles. You watched the tree line. You listened for the sound of branches snapping in ways that didn't belong to the wind. Because the forest wasn't yours. It never had been. It didn't care that you built fences. It didn't care that you prayed. It only cared that you remembered. And if you didn't, it had ways of reminding you. Quiet ones, permanent ones. Ones that didn't leave tracks. Even if you never stepped into the forest, even if you kept to the path and said the right prayers and carried the right charms, you could still look up and be reminded that the sky didn't belong to you either. You could keep your head down during the day, keep your hands busy and your thoughts guarded. But at night, when the work stopped and your eyes finally lifted, the sky offered no comfort. It was vast and cold and full of things you weren't meant to understand. Sometimes there were lights, strange ones, colors that shouldn't have been there, flickers that danced and pulsed just above the horizon. You couldn't name them. You didn't try to. You just watched and wondered who or what was watching back. Falling stars were never just stars. You were told they meant something. A death, perhaps. A sign. A soul leaving the earth. A warning. You crossed yourself when you saw one, and sometimes you whispered a name, just in case it was theirs. Sometimes it was. You didn't talk about that part. And long trails of fire that stayed too long in the sky, weeks at a time, glowing even through clouds, refusing to be ignored. They were never good. People said they came before war, before famine, before plague. Even if nothing happened, the fear settled in anyway, because fear didn't need proof. It only needed repetition. The priests said the heavens were the realm of God, but sometimes the sky felt more like a punishment than a promise. It changed without warning. It cracked with thunder. It lit up with bolts that touched trees and barns and people too slow to move, and it never explained itself. Eclipses were worse. The sun turned black or the moon turned red, and the world felt wrong. Birds went quiet. Dogs whimpered. People knelt without being told. Even those who mocked the old stories found themselves whispering beneath their breath. You didn't need to believe in omens to feel one. You learned not to look too long. Not because it would blind you, but because the longer you stared, the more you realized how little you knew. The sky held more than it held the weight of fate, the edge of the divine, the judgment you couldn't outrun. And if it wanted to, it could change everything with a single light that burned across the dark, leaving a streak you couldn't follow, and a silence that refused to explain itself. So you slept facing the wall. You prayed with your eyes closed, and when someone said they saw a light moving too slow across the northern sky, you just nodded. You didn't ask questions. You didn't want answers. Not really, because the sky was never still, and some fears didn't need names to be real. They only needed distance and a little light, and the feeling that the world above you was shifting in ways you were never meant to stop. And when it rang at the wrong hour, everyone stopped. You could be in the field, elbow deep in dirt, or by the river, soaking your hands in cold water, and the sound would still find you. Low and heavy, carried on wind that seemed to quiet everything else. The bell didn't ring for celebration unless someone told you ahead of time. If it rang without warning, it meant only one thing. Death had come, and someone had been taken. It didn't matter if you knew who. The first chime hit you in the chest. The next few filled the space around you like breath. You didn't mean to hold, you listened, not just for the rhythm, but for the number of strikes. 1 for a child, 2 for a woman, 3 for a man, just loud enough to make silence impossible. You didn't need to see the body. The bell told you enough. Sometimes, if the wind was right, you could hear it from miles away. A distant toll that turned your stomach before your mind even caught up. It was worse when you recognized the pattern, worse still when you didn't, and had to wait for the name to arrive by word of mouth. The priest would walk the village with ash on his thumb. The doors would shut, the fire would be lowered. If it was someone close to you, you'd feel your chest hollow in a way that had nothing to do with crying. You wouldn't scream. You wouldn't wail. That wasn't how it worked. You'd nod. You'd swallow hard. You'd touch the edge of your sleeve like you didn't know what to do with your hands. The bell didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait until you were ready. It just rang again and again until the sound settled into your ribs. And long after it stopped, you still heard it. In the rhythm of your footsteps, in the way people said your name a little softer, in the way no one laughed that afternoon. Sometimes when no one had died, the bell rang anyway, for storms, for invaders, for plague. Each had its own rhythm, its own message. The bell was language, warning, judgment. You were told to be grateful for it, that it gave you time, that it let you prepare. But it never felt like time. It felt like a countdown, a reminder that life, no matter how quiet, was always one breath from being interrupted. You learned to listen closely, to count the echoes, to pause whatever you were doing until it ended, because the bell never rang for nothing. It rang because something had changed, because someone was missing, because the air had shifted, and in the Middle Ages, when the bell spoke, no one dared to ignore it. Not even God. The bell rang for death, but the wolf didn't. The wolf made its own announcement. A long, low sound that started like a moan and ended like a warning. It came through the trees, over the frost, across the roofs of houses that barely held heat. And when you heard it, you didn't move. You held still. Because the howl wasn't just a sound, it was a reminder. Wolves were real in a way most fears weren't. They left tracks. They tore fences. They came close enough to smell, not often, but often enough. And always in winter, when hunger made everything sharper. You told yourself they wouldn't come to the door, wouldn't climb the hill, wouldn't cross the open yard. but people had said the same before and been wrong. In summer, you could pretend they lived somewhere else, in the deeper woods beyond the far edge of the grazing fields, but in winter they came closer, not just one, but many. Packs moved like shadows, silent until they wanted to be known. They watched from tree lines, waited near barns, pulled at the edges of the world you thought was yours. You kept the animals in, double-bolted the pens, stacked wood high against the barn doors. You carried a torch when you left the house, even if it was only a few steps, and you taught children not to cry at night, not loudly, because the wolves listened too. Stories followed them, that they were cursed men, that they understood language, that if one locked eyes with you, it would never forget your face. You didn't need to believe the stories to respect them. All you needed was a glimpse of the aftermath. A sheep's body split open in the snow, or a trail of blood that led into the woods and ended without explanation. When the howling came close, you lay still in your bed and counted your breath. You thought of the fire dying too quickly. You thought of the thinness of the door. You thought of the blade near your feet and whether it would be enough. You didn't sleep much on those nights. Not really. Sleep had no place beside a sound like that. And in the morning, when the light returned and the howling stopped, you stepped outside. You looked for paw prints, checked the pens, scanned the tree line. You never saw them, not directly. Just the empty space where something had been, the silence of birds, the tension in the dogs, the chill that remained even when the wind was still. You didn't need to see teeth to know they were there. You didn't need to see eyes to feel them watching. In the Middle Ages, fear didn't need to be visible. It only needed to make a sound. And the sound the wolf made stayed with you long after it faded. Because when you heard the howl, you knew the edge of safety had moved again. And this time it was closer than before. There were wolves in the woods and shadows in the sky. But some fears came from inside, not from hunger or sound, but from the creeping weight of uncertainty. You could do everything right. You could pray at the right hours, cross yourself at the bell, keep your fast kneel when told. And still something could go wrong, something small. A word said in jest, a thought that came too quickly, a moment of impatience you didn't correct, and suddenly your chest felt heavy and your luck soured, and the cow wouldn't stand and the bread wouldn't rise. And you wondered, had you sinned and not noticed? That was the hardest part, not the fire, not the illness, but the not knowing. The way a quiet fear crept in and sat beside you, whispering that maybe this was your fault, that maybe you had invited this. Not on purpose, but through ignorance, a forgotten vow, a missed holy day, a joke you shouldn't have laughed at. You asked the priest. Sometimes asked in low voices at the edge of the altar, with your head bowed. And sometimes he answered with a nod and a verse. And sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he said only that sin comes in many forms, and it is not always seen until it bears fruit. That was the word he used, as if suffering was a harvest, and you had planted the seeds without even realizing. You watched yourself closely after that, checked your tone when you spoke, replayed conversations in your head, wondered if your envy had shown when your neighbor's sheep bore twins, wondered if your hunger for more bread during Lent had reached God's ears. You apologized more often, even for things you didn't fully understand. The church offered structure, yes, but it also offered mirrors, and not all of them were kind. You were told to examine your heart, to confess not just what you had done, but what you had wanted to do, what you had felt, what you had imagined even briefly, because even those thoughts could stain you. Even those thoughts could build into something darker. You feared being wrong. But worse, you feared being wrong in silence. Living every day with a quiet curse you couldn't name. Watching your child fall ill, and wondering if your carelessness had caused it, watching your harvest spoil, and wondering if your doubt during prayer had soured the grain. So you walked carefully, spoke gently, hid your anger under folded hands. And when misfortune came, as it always did, you didn't raise your voice. You looked inward. You scoured your days for cracks, and you prayed, not just for protection, but for clarity, that if you had sinned, it would be shown to you before it was too late. Because in the Middle Ages, fear didn't always roar or howl. Sometimes it whispered from within, and the most frightening sin was the one you didn't know you'd already committed. You could live your life carefully. You could measure your words, carry your charm, confess your thoughts, and still, one morning, wake to silence. Not the good kind. Not the kind that comes with fresh snow or gentle prayer, but a heavy, wrong kind. The kind where the birds don't sing, where the dogs don't bark, where the air feels thick, even though there's no wind. The kind of silence that tells you something has already happened, and that it's too late. The plague didn't announce itself. It didn't march or howl, it crept. It moved in breath and cloth and warmth. It passed between hands and water, and the space between two people praying in the same pew. It didn't care if you were good. It didn't care if you were poor or noble, clean or careful. It came as it liked and left only what it didn't take. You would hear a cough, then another. Then someone wouldn't open their shutters for morning bread. Then someone else wouldn't come to the well. Then the priest would start knocking on doors without waiting to be invited. Then the bell would ring twice, 3 times, too many times. And people would begin to whisper that it had arrived, that it had returned. It happened fast, sometimes in hours. One moment a neighbor was sweeping his doorstep, and the next he was shivering in bed, too weak to speak, skin already turning dark around the edges. There were signs, but no rules. Some burned. Some simply faded, like the sickness had reached deep inside and blown out the candle before anyone could see it flicker. People tried things. Fires in the streets to purify the air. Vinegar-soaked cloths pressed to the face. Prayers, so many prayers. And still, the dead came faster than the gravediggers could keep pace. Some were buried in haste. Some not at all. You saw the fear in your neighbor's face when you knocked, and they didn't open the door. You understood you wouldn't have opened yours either, because the plague didn't just take bodies. It took certainty. It took the idea that anything could be known or predicted or controlled. It reminded you that you were small, that you lived at the mercy of something you couldn't see and didn't understand, something that didn't knock or ask or wait, something that simply appeared. And by the time you realized it was here, it had already passed through your door. When the plague came, it left behind more than grief. It left behind a smell. It wasn't always strong at first, just a heaviness in the air, a sourness that clung to skin and straw, a thickness in the throat that made you swallow more than usual. It hung low in the alleyways, near the church doors, along the stone walls where people passed, but didn't linger. And as the sickness spread, the smell deepened. It grew into something sharp, something that coated your tongue and stayed on your clothes no matter how many times you stepped into smoke or washed your hands with bitter herbs. They said it was the scent of sin, that it was God's warning, or worse, his judgment. You heard it from the pulpit that the air was unclean because souls were unclean, that the stench was not from death alone, but from the rot of a world that had turned too far from grace. People believed it, or at least they feared it enough to act as if they did. You lit fires of sweet wood, juniper pine, sometimes rosemary if you had any, not just for warmth, but to cleanse the air, to fight back against whatever unseen curse had settled into the streets. You hung herbs above your door and pressed cloths soaked in lavender to your nose, But still the smell came through. The smell of sickness, of spoiled breath, of wrongness. It wasn't just the dead, it was the dying, it was the fear. Sometimes the priest walked the village swinging a censer, incense pouring out in thick spirals that drifted like fog. It helped a little, but only for a moment, because the truth was that the smell never left. It found its way into your pillow, into your bread, into the space beneath your nails. You started to wonder if you were imagining it, if maybe it wasn't outside anymore, but inside you, that maybe it wasn't a warning from God, but a sign that you were already marked. The body knew before the mind did. You could walk past a house and know someone not from sound, not from sight, just from the air that clung around the door. It didn't announce itself loudly. It didn't need to. It simply wrapped itself around you, and you understood. Something holy had been broken. People stopped speaking of it directly. They talked about signs, about behavior, about repentance, but they didn't mention the smell, because the smell meant it was real. The smell meant it had touched something close to you. And after a while, you started to associate every scent with warning. Smoke, rain, sweat, bread gone sour. You stopped trusting your nose. You stopped trusting your lungs. You breathed shallow. You opened windows you didn't want open, and you waited, because if it came again you would know, before the fever, before the bell you would know by the air. And that alone was enough to keep you afraid. The smell lingered long after the sick were gone, and in the quiet that followed, people began to look for what had caused it. Not just the plague itself, but the deeper reason, the hidden crack in the world that let it in. You were told it was sin, but sometimes sin didn't feel close enough. Sometimes it felt like something had helped it along, like someone had opened the door. That's when people began to speak in lower voices, about bread that didn't rise, milk that turned too fast, a neighbor's child who spoke in her sleep and said names no one had taught her. You didn't accuse anyone, not at first, but you watched. You remembered small things you'd once dismissed. The woman who gathered herbs by moonlight, the man who muttered to himself in the field, the old one who had never been sick, not once, even when the whole family fell. Things that had seemed odd now seemed dangerous. Curses were real to you, not like in stories, not loud or dramatic, just quiet things. Whispers sent through a locked door, objects buried beneath your doorstep, powder in the flour sack, a thread wrapped 3 times around the door latch. You didn't always see it happen, but you felt the weight of it, a heaviness in your bones, a change in the air before the storm. A dream that didn't belong to you. When the harvest failed, people looked for blame. When someone died suddenly, they remembered who had quarreled with them last. You were told to forgive, but your hands still itched when you passed the wrong person in the street. It was easier to think the world had been cursed than to believe it had simply broken on its own. You started to mark your bread with the sign of the cross before baking, not just because the priest said so, but because something in you needed protection, needed the loaf to be more than flour and fire. Wind wasn't just wind, it carried voices, warnings, sometimes laughter, the kind you weren't supposed to hear. And if a storm blew in too quickly or changed direction without reason, someone would say it aloud. Someone had called it not with voice, maybe, but with thought, with intention, with some old word they never should have learned. You carried iron in your pocket. You spit 3 times over your left shoulder. You swept the threshold twice after dark. You weren't even sure where you'd learned the rules, only that they had been taught without words. And if you didn't follow them, something small might turn large, something safe might twist, something warm might vanish. In a world where death came without warning, you needed something to explain it. And if not God, then something smaller, something near, something human, maybe, but with eyes that stayed open too long. because when the world turned, it was easier to believe you were cursed than to believe no one was in control at all. Once you believed that curses could come in bread, and spells could ride the wind, it wasn't hard to believe that names held power too. Not all names, just some. The ones that had been whispered in fear, the ones said in anger, or desperation, or grief that had nowhere else to go. You were careful with those names. You didn't speak them at night. You didn't repeat them more than once. You didn't teach them to your children. Some names were forgotten on purpose, and that forgetting became a kind of safety. It wasn't about being superstitious. It was about survival, because once a name was said aloud, it could draw attention. Maybe not immediately, maybe not ever, but maybe, and in a world where too much was uncertain, a maybe was all it took to keep your mouth closed. There were names that belonged to the dead, not just the recently buried, but the ones who died wrong, without confession, without blessing, without peace. You didn't call them by name because it might call them back. It might bring their memory closer than it should be. It might confuse the boundary between what was living and what should stay buried. Some names belonged to people who had vanished, left the village without a word, or with too many words, accused of something, marked by something. When they were gone, you let their names go too. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear that speaking them would open something that had finally closed. And then there were the names said to belong to other things. Things not seen but felt. The kinds of names that showed up in old books or half-remembered prayers from older tongues. Names you were told not to repeat. Names that made the fire flicker when they were whispered. Names that never sounded quite human. If someone said one by accident, drunk or daring or careless, everyone went quiet, not angry, just still. The kind of silence that waited to see if anything would follow. You'd cross yourself, you'd touch wood, you'd say something else quickly, something holy, just to balance the air, and then you wouldn't speak of it again. Even friendly names could become dangerous if they belonged to someone you loved too much. If you called to them while they were away. If you spoke their name into an empty room, because sometimes it wasn't them who answered, and you didn't want to invite the wrong thing by accident, so you spoke carefully. You learned to describe without naming, to gesture, to glance, to say, the old one, or that woman near the edge, or you know who. And everyone did know. That was enough. The name didn't need to be said. Because in the Middle Ages, names weren't just words, they were doors. And some doors, once opened, didn't shut the same way again. You could avoid names. You could keep your words soft, your eyes low, your charms in place. But when someone knocked on your door after dark, all your carefulness drained into the floor, because the one thing worse than a voice in the wind was a hand on the latch when no one was supposed to be there. In the daylight, a stranger might mean trade or gossip or a traveller in need of, but after sundown there was no reason to visit, only need or danger or something that wore a face it hadn't been born with. The knock was always too quiet or too loud, never right. It came just as the fire dimmed, just as you'd begun to think the night might pass without trouble. It came with no bell, no greeting, no sound of horse or cart, just the knock, and then silence. You didn't open right away, you waited. You looked to others in the room. Sometimes no one moved, sometimes someone whispered a prayer. If you had to open it, if you truly had to, you did it slowly, with one hand near your knife, the other on the doorframe, your foot ready to press it closed again. You didn't say who's there, because sometimes the thing at your door didn't need an invitation. Sometimes all it needed was your voice. Sometimes it was nothing. A neighbor drunk and confused. A traveler turned around. A woman from 2 villages over, looking for shelter, and you'd feel foolish for your fear, even as your heart still pounded. But other times, you knew something was wrong before the door was even half open. Something in the eyes, something in the stillness. People who didn't blink enough, people who didn't step back when you stepped forward. People who asked for names or children or blessings, but couldn't meet your gaze when you offered them. You didn't ask too many questions. You never invited them in. You gave them what you could: bread, water, the edge of a candle, and you watched until they turned away. Then you locked the door twice. Then you salted the threshold. Then you whispered to yourself, just in case they weren't what they seemed. Because stories moved faster than feet, and you'd heard the tales of figures that wandered from house to house, looking like people you once knew, of spirits that knocked only once, of creatures that waited for you to speak before they could enter. Not all stories were true, but enough were close. And sometimes, worst of all, there was no knock, just the door swinging open softly, as if it had forgotten how to stay closed. So you sat near the fire, you kept your back to the wall. You watched, and when someone knocked after dark, you listened first. Not just to the sound, but to everything around it. Because in a world ruled by faith and fear, not everyone who found your home was meant to be welcomed. After enough nights, with knocks you didn't answer, after enough glances toward windows you couldn't fully cover, you started to feel it settle. Not just around you, but inside the house itself. Fear in the Middle Ages didn't live only in the woods or in the dark corners of the church. It lived in your home. It lived in the cracks of the beams and the lines in the floor. It settled in the space between the hearth and the bed. It watched from places where light never reached, even at noon. You told yourself the house was strong, that the roof held, that the walls stood firm, that the door could keep out the cold, and maybe it did. But fear didn't need wind to slip inside. It came through memory, through silence, through all the nights where nothing happened, but something almost did. The walls listened. You felt it sometimes when you whispered too close to them, when you sat alone and noticed how still everything had become. You remembered stories about voices heard in rafters, never quite loud enough to make sense, about stones that stayed cold no matter how close the fire burned. You didn't speak of it directly, but you knew. Everyone did. Some families carved marks above door frames, simple shapes, crosses, the old letters no one pronounced anymore. Not for beauty, not for tradition, but to hold something in place. You hung things too: bunches of dried herbs, strips of wool twisted 3 times and tied with ash. Not because they were beautiful, because the walls needed reminders that this house was watched, that someone still lived here, that someone still believed. On the worst nights, the walls didn't creak from wind, they pulsed, they breathed. Not with sound, but with presence. You sat still and felt it, like something waiting for you to look the wrong way. Something that would reveal itself if you lit the wrong candle, or spoke the wrong name, or let your thoughts drift too far from God. Sometimes during plague years or after strange deaths, houses were abandoned. Not burned, not torn down, just left. And everyone understood why. Not because the roof had fallen, but because the fear in those walls had become too loud. You could walk past one and feel it through the stone, that a house could die without anyone dying inside it. That fear, left long enough, could shape wood and bone and silence into something that never fully let go. So you swept. You prayed aloud, even when no one was listening. You fed the fire, even when it was already warm. You named the good things out loud so the bad things wouldn't claim the space. Because home wasn't always safety. Not here, not always. And sometimes when everything was quiet. And still, you listened to the walls in return, just to be sure nothing had changed. just to remind yourself you were still the one inside. Even if your house was quiet, even if the wind didn't move, and the forest stayed still, and no one knocked after dark, you still weren't safe, because no matter how well you sealed your windows, or prayed over your bread, or watched the shadows behind the fire, there was one truth you could never quite forget. Hell was always watching, not waiting. Watching because waiting meant there was a choice. Watching meant it already knew. You didn't need to see it. You didn't even need to speak of it. It was enough to know it was there, just beneath the skin of the world. The church taught you that hell wasn't far away. It wasn't in some distant realm or under the sea. It was below your feet, beneath the earth, behind the veil of things you took for granted. You walked on its roof. You slept above its gates. You prayed, not to stay alive, but to stay out of its reach. Images of it filled your mind even if you'd never seen them with your eyes. You'd heard the stories. Priests spoke them slowly, and everyone listened. The lakes of fire, the endless teeth, the screams that didn't stop, not because they were dramatic, but because they were promised. You believed in heaven, but it was harder to picture. It was light. It was peace. It was a reward. But hell was vivid. You could almost hear it. You carried that fear like a second skin, not just when you sinned, but when you hesitated, when your thoughts drifted, when you felt envy you couldn't explain, or desire you couldn't name, or anger you didn't control. You feared not just punishment, but the absence of forgiveness, that you might do something and not even know it was enough to tip the scale, that your repentance might come too late, that mercy might have already passed you by. There were signs you were told, sudden sickness, strange weather, dreams filled with fire or teeth or twisting shapes you couldn't describe when you woke. You could confess, you could fast, you could beg, but still the edge never moved far from you. You lived your life as if the ground beneath you might crack open at any moment. Some people said they saw glimpses. Shapes moving in the corners of the church, faces in the smoke during Mass, eyes blinking once too slowly in the reflection of holy water. You didn't ask questions when they told those stories. You just nodded, because part of you believed it too. So you stayed careful. You swallowed your pride, your doubts, your hungers. You tried to be good, even when you weren't sure what that meant, because the worst fear wasn't pain. It wasn't death. It was the sound of the gates closing behind you. The moment you realized they had been open all along, and that hell hadn't come for you, because it had been here the whole time. You tried to keep your soul clean. You whispered the right prayers. You stepped carefully. You looked away from temptation and listened when the church bells told you to kneel. But even if you did everything right while you were awake, you still had to sleep. And in sleep, you lost control. That's where it came from next. That's where it found you. Because in the Middle Ages, dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages, warnings, sometimes from God, sometimes from something else. You kept them quiet, held behind your teeth like a splinter. You couldn't pull free. You woke with your heart racing, with your hands damp and your throat dry. You stared at the ceiling and waited for the sky to lighten. And you wondered, what had you seen? Was it just a vision, or was it a prophecy? You were told to pay attention, because the world didn't always speak in daylight. Sometimes it came to you at night when your defenses were down and the soul wandered further than it should. Some dreams were clear, a road crumbling underfoot, a mouth filled with ash, a child walking into a fire and smiling. You knew they weren't real, but they stayed with you anyway. And some dreams were stranger, a voice you recognized saying words you didn't, a door that never opened no matter how hard you pushed, a field of bones under a sun that didn't move. You told the priest, sometimes if you were brave. He would nod slowly and ask what you had eaten, but his eyes would shift just slightly. because he'd heard these things before. People said dreams came from the soul leaving the body and walking too far, that it saw things it shouldn't, that it came back carrying shadows. And if the dream returned more than once, you listened, you changed your behavior, you lit candles in the names of people you hadn't thought of in years. Because the dream wasn't just about you, it might be about someone else. And if you ignored it, you didn't just risk your own fate, you risked theirs. There were women who could read dreams. Not officially, not openly. You didn't say their names aloud, but if the dream came again, and if it wouldn't leave, you found your way to their door. You told them what you'd seen. You waited while they closed their eyes and counted knots in a cord. You left something behind. A coin, a slice of bread, a curl of your hair. You didn't ask what they did with it. You didn't want to know. Because sleep wasn't rest, not always. Not here. Not when dreams could open doors you never meant to touch. And when you woke, blinking in the still, dark morning. You didn't just thank God for breath. You thanked him for keeping your soul tethered and for letting you return at all. There were dreams that warned you not to go, paths that curved too sharply, woods that leaned in the wrong direction, crossroads that echoed without sound. You didn't need to be told twice, because even after waking, the feeling clung to you, and out in the world when you stood before certain roads, the real ones, the crooked ones, the ones no one named, you recognized that same silence, that same pull. Some paths weren't cursed exactly, they just remembered too much. You learned early which ones to avoid. The narrow track behind the ruined mill. The old Roman road that never grew moss, no matter how many years passed. The path that curved around the edge of the field and never quite ended where it should. People still used them, sometimes. But never with ease, never without a glance over the shoulder, and never after. The priest might say all land belonged to God, but you knew better. You knew there were stretches that answered to something else, something older. Something that didn't care for prayers or fasting or the weight of a holy symbol pressed into your palm. It didn't seek you. It didn't call your name, but it watched. And it waited for you to forget. If you had to walk one, if time or circumstance or foolishness pushed you to it, you prepared. You kept your mouth closed. You didn't look too long at the trees. You didn't follow any sound, not even if it was familiar. Especially not then. You stepped lightly and didn't stray from the middle, even when the mud pulled at your feet or the wind whispered a better way, because you weren't alone out there, not really. Sometimes you came across things on those roads. A shoe with no tracks leading to it, a coin too clean for the weather, scratches in the bark shaped like symbols you half recognized from church walls and half from dreams you didn't speak of. You didn't touch them. You didn't ask. You walked on, and when you returned, if you returned, you didn't boast. You didn't tell the story loud. You waited to see if anything followed, if your dreams changed. If the wind carried your name a little too clearly, the next time you were alone, because some roads weren't just roads. They were boundaries between the known and the remembered, between the world you lived in and the one that hummed just beneath it. Not everything evil showed itself. Not everything holy protected you. Some paths tested you simply by being there, by tempting you to step just a little further, to see what others hadn't. And the worst ones didn't feel frightening at all. They felt quiet, peaceful. That's how you knew. Those were the ones no one should walk. And if you did, you never went twice. Not if you wanted to return with your name still your own. You've heard the knock, smelled the smoke, felt the silence that pressed too close. This was fear in the Middle Ages, not loud, not theatrical, but steady, woven into breath, bread, and the roads you never dared to name. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of being forgotten or worse, remembered by the wrong thing, and still they lived quietly. carefully, endlessly aware. This has been History for Sleep. Thank you for listening. Rest now, if you can. And if something stirs in the dark tonight, it's only the past remembering.